Blog Talk Radio.
Let's take time to wait upon the Lord. Let's take time to listen to His voice. Unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain. So let's take time to wait upon the Lord.
The race is not given to the swift, nor to the strong, but to the one that endureth until the end. There'll be problems, and sometimes you walk alone. But I know that I know that I know things will work out. Yes, they will, for the good of them. For the good of them who loves us, Lord.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Want to apologize for missing last week, but as you know, we had some extraordinary circumstances that we had to miss. But we're back now, and I want to say that I played that song because if we believe in God, we know that whatever he does, it will be for our good. And so that's my comment on that. We're in Luke 16. This is week 74 in our study through the Gospel of Luke. Week 74 hadn't been continuous, but that's how long we've been in the Gospel of Luke. So turn with me to Luke 16. We're going to look at the first 13 verses. But before we get there, our warrior verse challenge for this week is Proverbs 1, verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Proverbs 1, verse 10, our warrior verse challenge for this week. I received another question. The questioner said, Pastor Warren, what would you say to the pastor of a local church who says, I do not really care about how humanity started. I am just called to preach the gospel to the people in my church right now. They asked again, what would you say to him? I think I would probably start by asking that pastor, how important is the Bible to his ministry? Because if you tend to minister with a kind of Bible within a Bible, if you pick out the center that you like and just make that your Bible, rather than looking at the entire Bible, then I am probably going to have a hard time answering this question. But if you care about the entire Bible as God's inspired word, and if you believe that whatever center you identify is centered in the entire revelation because God thought it wise to give us an entire book in order to protect the sinner, then I think I would say to him, you have to care about the way the whole Bible characterizes human beings and the origin of human beings. Furthermore, the Bible presents a view that if you deny the historical Adam, you're probably going to set your people on the trajectory of understanding the Bible, or how to read the Bible that can undo the things that you think are more central. And so my first answer is more hermeneutical. What are you doing to the Bible when you neglect or disregard the teachings of the Bible? What are you going to do when Luke chapter 3 chases Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam and not just to Abraham? What are you going to do when the prophets themselves, like Hosea, refer to the covenant with Adam? What are you going to do when Jude refers to Enoch as the seventh from Adam? What are you going to do with Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, where the foundational nature of our problem of sin is drawn from the disobedience of our original father, Adam? And finally, I think the most important thing that I would say to a pastor like that is that when you get to Romans chapter 5, particularly verses 12 through 21, the way that Paul sets the entire problem with humanity and the whole resolution of that problem in Jesus Christ is by saying that Adam disobeyed God. And in Adam, we are all counted as sinners. Jesus obeyed God perfectly, and all who are in him are counted as righteousness. So the whole structure of salvation, particularly justification in the mind of Paul, is rooted in the way humanity relates to a single father, Adam. And then the way the new humanity relates to the single Father, Jesus Christ. So hermeneutically, it is going to be damaging for the people of his congregation, and they will not learn how to read their Bibles, and then they will start undermining teachings of the Bible. And then as far as salvation goes, as far as justification goes, you're going to undo the Pauline structure of biblical theology if you do away with the historical Adam. And I hope that helps, and I hope that answers the question. Luke chapter 16. Read with me verses 1 through 13. Reading from the New King James Bible. Now he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. No, it's not. No, it's not. Then the manager said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I'm removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors and began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures a week. He said to them, take your bill, write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relationship to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of righteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into eternal dwellings. He was faithful in very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is also unrighteous in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? For if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Every once in a while, I receive in the mail an ad inviting me to sign up for a book or a course on how I can get rich. It usually involves someone's scheme for buying stocks or trading commodities. And the person who is selling the book or offering the course is playing off the common desire of humanity to get rich, preferably with a minimum of effort. But here's the question. What if we spend our lives climbing the ladder of success only to find that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall? What if we get rich only to discover that we are really poor? In Luke 16, Jesus tells two parables, the unrighteous steward and the rich man and Lazarus. And he's doing this to show that God's perspective on riches and our perspective on riches are often diametrically opposed. And so if we really, truly want to be rich, we need God's perspective on money. Now, Jesus tells this first parable to the disciples. But the Pharisees, who verse 14 says were lovers of money, were listening in and scoffing at Jesus. So the ensuing instruction and the second parable in Luke 16 are mainly aimed at the Pharisees. But the entire chapter should make us all stop and carefully think about our attitude toward money. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 9 says that God's ways are higher than our ways. And this is especially true with regard to money. And so, since we are all prone to the world's ways, we need to think very carefully about what Jesus is saying so that we follow God's way to true riches rather than the world's way to deceptive wealth and ultimate eternal poverty. Now, the parable of the unrighteous servants causes many preachers a lot of grief. In fact, they call it the most difficult parable in the Gospel of Luke. Because here, Jesus is seemingly praising a scoundrel. But a careful look reveals that Jesus is not praising the man's crookedness, but rather his shrewdness in using a present opportunity to provide for his future inevitable needs. In fact, in verse 8, Jesus called the man unrighteous, condemning his wrong ways. But Jesus is saying that we can learn a valuable lesson from this scoundrel who is wiser than many sons of light, in that he saw what was coming and he used what had been entrusted to him while he could prepare himself for the future. And so the lesson for us is a faithful steward will use his master's money shrewdly to provide true riches for eternity. Jesus is telling us that there is a way that you can take money with you, namely by wisely investing the resources that God has entrusted to you now in things that will matter for eternity. And so Jesus draws four contrasts that should help us not to miss the point. Faithful versus unrighteousness. Be faithful, not unrighteous, in financial matters. Now, the first contrast is in verse 10, and that is between he who is faithful and he who is unrighteous. And Jesus is telling us, do not be unrighteous as the steward in the parable was, but you be faithful stewards as those who will give an account to the master. And I believe that there are two crucial concepts here that we need to understand. The first concept that we need to understand is the concept of stewardship. The concept of stewardship. God owns it. I manage it. See, implicit in Jesus' teaching, both here and elsewhere, is that God owns everything. And we are stewards, or managers, if you will, of what God has entrusted to us. In fact, we are stewards of our time, our abilities, and our possessions and money. And so, in the parable, the steward was squandering his master's possession, according to verse 1. Again, there is much debate over whether his action of reducing the bills of his master's debtor was illegal or legal. In fact, there are some who argue that his master had clearly and cleverly violated the Jewish laws against charging interest, and that the steward was rectifying the situation and putting the master in an awkward position of going along with the adjusted bills, or else openly being guilty of charging interest. And still, there are others who say that the steward was giving up his own commission on the sales. Others who say that the steward was stealing from his master. You know what? We cannot know for sure. But it seems to me that this steward was not doing anything illegal, or the master would have prosecuted him. And yet, while staying within the letter of the law and acting with the authority given to him, the steward was not acting in his master's best interest, but in his own interest. And so, even though the master lost a lot of money through the steward's actions, the master grudgingly had to praise the steward for his shrewdness. But the fact is, although shrewd, the steward was still unrighteous or unfaithful because he was using his master's money for his own selfish ends and not for the master's profit. Listen, one of the key concepts of being a steward is that the steward does not own what the master has entrusted to him. He merely manages it for the master's purpose. And if the steward begins to act as if he owns it, spending the owner's resources for his own personal betterment rather than for the master's benefit, that steward is an unrighteous, not a faithful steward. Now, the principle of stewardship is a fundamental concept in Christian living. When you keep it in focus, stewardship radically affects how you live. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2, moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. That word faithful could be translated trustworthy. To be faithful as a steward, you must keep in mind at all times that you do not own your money. God does. You do not own your car. God does. You do not own your house. God does. You do not own your life. God does. To forget or ignore God's purposes and to live as what we have is ours to use for our purposes is to abuse our stewardship by being unfaithful, unrighteous. Now, this might be a radical statement, but I believe that the concept of tithing has fostered the erroneous notion that 10% belongs to God and the rest is ours to use as we please. In fact, many pastors teach, I don't teach it, but many pastors teach tithing because if Christians would give just 10% of their income to the Lord's work, then giving would increase dramatically. In fact, if everyone in our church were only earning welfare level incomes and giving 10%, our church income would drastically increase. In fact, statistics vary, but the polls show that American Christians give far less than 10%. Conservative Christians give about 3 to 4%. which is about twice as much as the members of other denominations. But before we congratulate ourselves, did you know that the Mormons give an average of 6%, with 30 to 45% of Mormons giving 10% of their pre-tax income? Also, the polls will tell us that the more people make, the less they give as a percentage of their income. See, the more you earn, the more tempting it is to spend it on yourself rather than give to the work of the Lord. But I'm arguing that the concept that 10% belongs to the Lord and the rest is yours to use as you please, that's not a biblical concept. Because the biblical concept says 100% belongs to the Lord. Now, listen, the reason I don't teach tithing is because the New Testament standard for giving is not 10%. But as we read in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, but storing up as he may prosper. See, if under the law, 10% was required giving as a tax, a tithe, then under grace, the 10% should be at least the bare minimum. Now, even then, the Lord's purposes, God is the owner, not your purposes, should be the focus in managing what God has entrusted to you. But let me remind you that tithing is not the New Testament standard for giving. In fact, tithing was not even the Old Testament standard. Two types of giving: taxes and free will giving. And you're to give it as is in your heart to give. Now, 1 Timothy chapter 6 tells us that the Lord allows us to enjoy the bounty of his material blessings. But God also wants us to focus on storing up the treasure of a good foundation for the future by being generous and ready to share. And you see those both in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Read verse 17 and then read on to verse 19. See, to give sporadically on impulse or to give a pittance with no view of eternity, that is not to be a faithful steward. Now, the second concept that I want you to understand, the concept of accountability. The concept of accountability. Someday, I must give an account to God for my stewardship. Now, every business manager knows that the owner will be checking the books to see how things are going. If the business has been earning a profit for the owner, then the manager may get a raise. But if the manager has been skimming off the profits to finance his U-boat or his Mercedes-Benz, he is going to be in trouble when the books are examined. You see, the idea of accountability is inherent in the concept of stewardship. Now, crucial to being a good steward is understanding the owner's purpose for his business. Now, in our world, the purpose is usually to make all the money you can for as long as you can. But here's the question. What is our master's purpose? Well, Jesus tells us in verse 9, and I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. Now, the word mammon comes from the Aramaic word meaning riches. And by the phrase unrighteous mammon, Jesus means money, which the world uses for unrighteous purposes, which believers in Christ can use for the purposes of God. So Jesus means that just as the unrighteous steward used his master's money to make friends for himself, so that when he got fired, they would welcome him into their homes. So we should use our master's money to make friends for ourselves in heaven. The word they, some commentators say it refers to God and the angels. But I believe it refers to the friends who have become Christians because of our faithful stewardship when earthly riches fail, as they surely will do when we all die. We will have friends in heaven who are there because we gave to the cause of world evangelization. So each one of us must ask ourselves this sober question. Am I managing the resources God has entrusted to me with a view to giving an account someday in light of his purpose of being glorified among all the nations through the spreading of the gospel? Do I need to repeat it? Am I managing the resources that God has entrusted to me with a view to giving an account someday in light of his purpose of being glorified among all the nations through the spreading of the gospel? Listen, God is a generous and gracious Father who gives to us not only enough for our basic needs, but also for our enjoyment. So listen, don't get it wrong. It is not wrong that we enjoy the many things beyond the basic essentials. But if we understand the concept of faithful stewardship and faithful accountability, then our focus will not be on our own financial success, but rather on the financial success of God's work, namely the gospel. Now I want to give you the second point. Temporal versus eternal. Lay up treasures in heaven. Now, the second contrast of the three that all point to the same thing, namely temporal versus eternal. In verse 10, Jesus contrasts in what is least with much. In verse 11, unrighteous mammon with true riches. And in verse 12, what is another man's with your own. What is least, unrighteous mammon, and what is another's. All refer to the temporal resources, or they refer to money. It belongs to another, namely to God, as we have seen. So much, the true riches, and your own, all refer to the eternal treasures laid up in heaven, which no man can take from you, and so you truly possess them. Jesus said that the faithful steward will provide true riches for eternity, in contrast to this unrighteous steward who provided himself only with temporal provisions. I find it ironic that to us, money is a big deal. But to God, money is what is least. Now, if you do not think that money is a big deal to people, even to the people of God, just ask some dear old saint you know to part with his or her riches for the sake of the work of God and see exactly what kind of response you get. There was a wealthy man in his 80s, and he set up a fund to help young people who wanted to go into Christian work, who wanted to attend Christian colleges or seminaries. And the man moved out of the area, and the fund was depleted. So a pastor wrote him a very tactful letter, thanking him for his generosity and telling him some of the young people who had been helped, and also informing the man that the fund had been depleted. Well, the man wrote back an angry letter accusing the pastor and the church of being after his money. And he told them that if they ever asked him for money again, he would not give. But in fact, they had not even asked for any money. They had just informed the man that the fund he provided was depleted. The man could have given $100,000 to the fund, and he would still have plenty left for his years on earth. And sadly, none of his 4 adult children were Christians. And they were all financially successful. But rather than willing his large estate to the work of the Lord, the man probably willed it all to his unbelieving children, because his money was a very big deal to the man. Listen, but God views our money as a very little fact. Money is the litmus test by which God...
When it's PCS time, you know the drill. Pack, research the new base, get the kids in school, because family supports family. At American Public University, we support military families with flexible, affordable online education that moves with you. As a military spouse, your tuition rate is the same as your partner's, just $250 per credit hour. American Public University, education that moves with you. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.